Good afternoon and welcome to a short video on weathering with enamel washes. I've got some washes here from a range of suppliers. So I've got some by MIG, that's MIG Jimenez, who now does ammo by MIG products. I've got some AK Interactive washes. This one's called Track Wash, but it's not for us, it's for tank tracks. And I've got some Humbrol washes as well. Now I've got a sand wash here which I've used in the past, and I'll show you the effect you can get with that. All of these enamel washes are effectively thin enamel paints. The Humbrol wash is a little bit thicker and dustier than the others. The AK and the MIG washes have got very fine pigment in them, which makes them really useful for very fine levels of detail in a surface finish. So you can use these in two ways really. There's what modelers call a pin wash, which is something that I've done here already. And that's just to highlight very small details on the surface of a model, just to make the surface pop and bring that detail to life. So in this case, I've run some dark wash into those vents and into the hinge lines on the door just to bring them out. Now kind of at this range, at your normal viewing distance when you're back here, that kind of looks real to your brain. It's not really, it's actually what military modelers like to think of as hyperrealism. It's more real than real, and it's techniques that are widely used in military modelling as well, things like edge highlighting as well, which I'll tend not to use on railway models, just to make things seem more realistic than they really are. It actually has the effect of making things, if overdone, look slightly odd. But if carefully done, those kinds of things, so a pin wash for example, especially on model railway stock, really makes the detail stand out and draws your attention to it, which you wouldn't necessarily see and which you didn't see on the original model. The other thing you can do with enamel washes is you can basically apply a filter over the surface of a model, and that's what I've done with the sand coloured wash here. So that's applied twice, so I've done it, left it for 24 hours, then done it again on this wagon to give the effect of that spilt sand being washed down the side by rain. That's quite a common feature of these wagons, certainly in the late 70s, early 80s, before they were withdrawn. They weren't kept clean, and so the sand tended to be dropped onto the top and then would just get rain washed down the sides of the wagon. It should accumulate along the edge of the sole bar as well. Now I've not managed to achieve that effect with a wash, but I do have some products that I can show you in a later video that will do that job for us. I'll also touch on factory weathering. This is a factory weathered Bachmann PMV. It's a shame, it's a nice model, and you can actually see if you look carefully that some of these planks have been picked out in a different colour to suggest they've been replaced. But then the whole wagon's been given a coat of what I can only describe as Yellow River dirt. This is not a European colour, and it spoils the effect somewhat. And unfortunately nearly everything you buy weathered, unless it's some of the UK products, are going to be this colour, and I'll talk about how you can get that off. So let's get on and stick some paint onto a model. I've got a nice clean shiny new Bachmann PMV. I want to bring out all of the detail on it, so you can see that there are planks. If I just move that around in the light, you can see that there are planks moulded into the surface. There's little lines of rivets, there's hinge lines with large bolts through them, and all of that really at the moment is a little bit flat and difficult to see. So I'm going to use this brown wash, give it a good shake to activate the paint in it, and I'm going to put a nice layer of this wash onto the surface of the model. I'm going to use a fairly large brush. If I was doing a pin wash, I'd be using a very small brush, just to get the paint where I absolutely want it, but for something like this, I'm just going to pick up a fair amount of paint on the brush, and let's just work it onto the door. And then as I've got enough of it, I'll pull it out along the sides. Just make sure I wipe it off the roof. I don't really want any brown paint sitting on the roof. Now straight away you can see, even though that's lying flat, the paint is starting to run around on the surface of the model, and that's the factory finishes tend to repel paint. It works, it's particularly true with acrylics as well, so if you've got a water-based wash, it will run away from the edges rather than hiding in them. So let's just get a decent coat of paint on. Let's just make sure I've got enough pigment on the model before I move on to the next stage. So this isn't the end of it. This feels like a factory weathering exercise. At the moment I've just slapped some paint on and told you that that's the lot. What I'm going to do, let's put that down there. I'm going to clean my brush off. I don't really want the enamels drying out, especially if I use a different colour, so I'm just going to give that a swoosh in the white spirit. And then dry it out. And then I'm going to let this dry for a couple of minutes. So as that's drying, let's have a look at something. Here's one I did earlier, as it were. Now this is a Parkside kit. There's the ready to run Hornby model for comparison. They were both roughly the same colour before I started. But on this one I've used a very dark wash, so I've used the dark wash, pushed it all onto the model and let it really dry. So actually it's almost completely dried out before I've started to work it. That's enabled me then to use a large flat brush to pull the paint down the side of the wagon, but also to get into these areas underneath the strapping, which allows me then to leave a marks all the way around the strapping and in the door openings and in the corners of the door, because this large brush isn't flexible enough to take the paint out of these areas. That's quite a pleasing effect and not entirely unrealistic. The main issue with this is, having weathered the body of the wagon, it's still got a black chassis, and I'll come back to that in another video. So again, I won't do that one now, maybe we'll have a look at that one later on. So this paint is starting to go off. I've got quite a few lights on, so the effect we're looking for is to basically drag that paint down the side of the model so that any residual effects after the paint has dried will look like rain marks. And really it's just a case of taking the brush and pulling it down the side of the vehicle. Now this is going to take most of the wash off, and that's the point. I don't want a huge amount of paint left on the model. I just want it to settle in some of the cracks and crevices and along the bottom edge of the body, so where the paintbrush hasn't quite got into, there'll be some dirt left. Just dry that off. I'm going to go again with a slightly smaller brush now, because I want to try and tailor these effects a little bit more carefully. So I'm just going to gently brush this down the side of the model. It is very, very light. I'm trying not to take too much of this paint off, but what I want to do is move it around. The other thing I want to take care of as well is just make sure that the lettering doesn't get too much of a tint on it. These vinyl letters tended to reject dirt, and even if they were hand painted, they tended to reject dirt, so they stayed relatively clean even if the rest of the wagon was fairly filthy. And actually numbers and data panels would be washed off more frequently anyway by staff. So here we are. That's a 2-minute job. Got some paint on, I've brushed it off, I've cleaned my brushes out, and here we are. What we've got is evidence, hopefully, that there's some dirt settling in the planks. Now for this van, that's probably as far as I'm going to go. I need to do all 4 sides obviously, but I really don't want it to be too dirty. I want to suggest this wagon's been reasonably recently overhauled and it's just been running in traffic for a few months. And for that then we'll have collected some dirt, as you can see, on the top edges of the hinge lines and inside all of those planks. Now some of these, even though I've put a wash on, have actually still rejected any kind of tint. So what I'm going to do now is I am actually going to pin wash some of these planks just to make sure that there's a colour in there. If I touch the paint against the end, you can actually see capillary action whizzing it down the whizzing it down the planks. Now those ones there don't appear to have picked it up. This door's not too bad, but let's just dab a bit on the end of the wagon as well, because again it doesn't seem to have sucked into the woodwork very well. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to go down the inside edge of the door with what's left on my brush, because again dirt will accumulate. If I go down the strapping as well, dirt will accumulate on the rivets and the strapping. Okay, just clean that off. Where's my wash? Here it is. Again, we're going to let that go off for a couple of minutes. Okay, now this is a slightly different technique. Having done a light brown wash on this Bachmann Ready to Run wagon, which has brought out all that plank detail quite nicely, I'm going to turn now to an old kit that I built some years ago and then gave a basic coat, as you can see from the end, of airbrush weathering. So this is track colour, it's a sort of dark earth brown. I've gone over the whole model with it, and while that's made the windows look suitably grubby, it's actually killed the surface detail completely, so what you see is a brown wagon. What you don't see is any of the detail on it. What I've done is I've painted MIG's dark wash over the side of this wagon, and I'm going to let that dry out, and then we're going to brush that finish away and then try and reinstate the depth of detail in the planking. So we're just going to leave that to dry. Then when we come back, I'll take that off and then we'll see what it looks like when we're done. Okay, we've given this a few minutes to dry out. Let's just start manipulating this finish. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a nice wide brush to try and take off as much of this weathering as I can from the surface, just to leave it again in the depressions on the body side. Now this isn't a Bachmann Ready to Run, this is actually a Parkside kit, so the definition is slightly different in the original mould. But again, if I remove a fair amount of that, what I'm left with, if we go back to the other side, you can see that dusty finish. I'm left with a slightly darker finish, but it's now much more apparent that there's planks on this wagon. The planks are only evident in certain places on that side. On this side it's much clearer on the door, and that's what the pin wash has done. In this case it's actually settled in the planks, and I've removed it from as much of the model as I can. Make sure that brush is nice and clean. What I don't want to do is put this brush in thinners, because that will just take everything off, so I need to keep wiping the brush off as I'm working it down the model, removing the paint. Again, I'm just going to go along the model a little bit just to lift some more of the paint out off the surface, and just make sure I've got it off the brush. Now, as you can see, this enamel's almost dry. And if I get my cotton bud and just rub it on something, you can still see that the paint is wet and active. Actually, what I'm going to do is again take it off those surfaces, because they would tend to stay quite clean, and I'm also going to remove my finish from the windows. Even though the windows are frosted and covered in clag, I don't want them too dark. So again, let's just get into the crevices and make sure I take all of that new enamel wash off of the glazing. No, still not quite light enough, so again I'm just going to go into this model and just work at it with the brush and lift off some more of that finish. As I say, the thing you can do with washes is you can reactivate them. So this is nearly dried out. What I want to do really is I want to pick that up and remove some more of this paint. So what I can do, if I just dab that into the white spirit, I'm going to take most of it off on a piece of kitchen roll. It's the white spirit equivalent of dry brushing. And then I'm just going to run it down the model. Now immediately you can see that the surface has darkened again because I've put some thinners on it, but also you can see that I'm moving that paint again and I'm moving that wash about and it's collecting at the bottom of the sides, and I'm taking it off of the raised areas because I don't really want it to be settling on the surface. I just want it to be sitting in the planks and over those hinges. Also, that does mean I can just take some finish off of the lettering again to bring it up a little bit so it stands out a little more. I can also just remove it off of those vents. So back to the big dry brush now for another work down the model. So that will take the paint off, that will help it collect, and I think that will do. So again, just going to find a clean bit of this cotton bud, probably there, and just make sure I haven't got any of my new wash on the glazing. It's just gone back to the original spray finish. I'm going to stop there. You can see there's a little bit of dampness at the bottom of the doors, which I'll just hoover out with that, and we'll leave that as it is. So now plank's much better defined compared to the other side, and also that overall spray finish has been slightly brought to life by having some of the panels and hinges and rivets picked out with that wash. But again, because the wagon is already brown, a darker wash is needed. A lighter wash would look very odd, and using that brown that I've used on this one would actually make very little difference in this case because I've already got a brown colour on it. And that's about it. Let's talk about taking factory finishes off next.